Strange tales, yet mirrors of human life. Hey everyone! Welcome to Encountering Chinese, Strange Tales from Zhai. Today I'm going to bring you a story called Chang'e. Zhai, a native of Taiyuan, had set off with his father in search of education. After some time wandering, they eventually settled in Yangzhou. Zhai's father had a long-standing friendship with Mrs. Lin, an elderly woman who lived near the Hong Bridge. One day, as father and son passed by the bridge, they unexpectedly ran into Mrs. Lin. She warmly invited them to her home for tea and a chat. At that moment, a beautiful young woman stood by Mrs. Lin's side, and Zhai's father couldn't help but praise her beauty. Mrs. Lin, observing the compliment, smiled and said, "Your son is gentle and honest, like a young lady. He's clearly a person of good fortune. If you don't mind, why not marry him off to this girl? What do you think?" Zhai's father chuckled, prompting his son to thank Mrs. Lin, and then said, "But you'd better keep your word." As it turned out, Mrs. Lin had lived alone for many years. One day, a young woman appeared at her door, saying that she was orphaned and alone in the world. Mrs. Lin, moved by her plight, asked the girl's name. The girl replied, "My name is Chang'e." Feeling great sympathy, Mrs. Lin took her in. Yet, secretly, Mrs. Lin had other intentions. She believed that the girl might be a valuable asset, and if she could marry her off, it might bring considerable wealth. At the time, Zhai was only 14 years old. Upon seeing Chang'e, he immediately felt a deep affection for her and thought that surely his father would send a matchmaker to propose. But when his father returned home that day, he seemed to have forgotten about it. Zhai, feeling anxious, secretly told his mother. Upon hearing this, Zhai's father laughed and said, "A few days ago, I was just joking around with that greedy Mrs. Lin. Do you know how much bride price she'll ask for the girl? We'd probably have to sell everything we own just to afford it. It's not as simple as you think." However, a year later, both of Zhai's parents passed away. But Zhai never forgot about Chang'e. After the mourning period, he asked a matchmaker to approach Mrs. Lin and bring up the marriage promise. At first, Mrs. Lin refused to acknowledge it. Enraged, Zhai said, "I don't back down easily. Does Mrs. Lin think my sincerity is worth nothing? If you're going to break your promise, then return all the gifts you received when the marriage was first arranged." Mrs. Lin, unwilling to part with the gifts, quickly changed her tune and said, "At the time, the marriage promise with your father was just a joke, and I forgot about it. But now that I think of it, yes, there was such a thing. But our families never officially formalized the engagement, and there was no written contract. Since you have feelings for Chang'e, how could I, for the sake of wealth, marry her off to a noble in the palace? I've always cared for her, dressing her up beautifully every day, all in hopes of receiving a bride price of 1,000 taels of silver. Our families have been long-time acquaintances. Here's what I'll do. You only need to give me 500 taels, and I'll marry Chang'e to you." Zhai, realizing that he could never come up with such a large sum of money, reluctantly gave up on the idea. West of Zhong Zimei's house lived a widow with a daughter around 16 or 17 years old, known by her childhood name, Diandong. One day, Zhong Zimei happened to catch sight of her and was stunned. Her beauty was in no way inferior to Chang'e's. From that moment, he found himself drawn to Diandong and began looking for ways to get close to her, frequently bringing small gifts to her home. As time passed, they gradually became familiar with each other, often exchanging glances, but they could never find a chance to speak in private. One night, Diandong climbed over the wall and whispered that she needed to borrow a flame. Zhong Zimei was overjoyed and immediately took hold of her hand. That very night, they lay together. Afterward, Zhong Zimei proposed that she marry him, but Diandong hesitated and said they should wait until her elder brother returned from his travels before making any decisions. From then on, the two met whenever they could, always in secret, making sure no one else saw them. One day, as Zhong Zimei happened to pass by Hong Bridge, he caught sight of Chang'e sitting alone at Mrs. Lin's house. She raised her hand and gestured for him to come over. He hesitated. She signaled again, more insistently this time, leaving him with no choice but to step inside. As soon as they were close, Chang'e's expression darkened. "You broke your promise," she said, her tone filled with quiet reproach. Zhong Zimei sighed, knowing he could not avoid the truth. "Let me explain," he said, and he told her everything. Chang'e listened in silence. Without a word, she turned and disappeared into the inner room. Moments later, she returned, holding a gold ingot, worth about 500 taels of silver, and placed it in Zhong Zimei's hands. Startled, he shook his head and pushed it back toward her. "I can't accept this," he said firmly. "I know our fate together has already come to an end. Not long ago, I pledged myself to another. If I take this gold today, I'll betray her. And if I take your gold and don't marry you, I'll be betraying you as well. I don't want to be the kind of man who carries the weight of such shame. I don't want to hurt either of you." For a long moment, Chang'e said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. "I know about your engagement to that girl. But your marriage will never come to pass. If it were meant to be, I wouldn't have called you here today. But there is nothing more I can say now. You must leave at once. Mrs. Lin will be back any moment." Zhong Zimei's mind was in turmoil, but there was no time to think. In the rush of the moment, he found himself taking the gold she pressed into his hands before hastily making his way home. The next day, Zhong Zimei told Diandong everything. To his surprise, she agreed with Chang'e and even urged him to focus on marrying her. Zhong Zimei remained silent, clearly torn. It wasn't until Diandong softly added that she was willing to become his concubine that his expression finally brightened with a smile. Without hesitation, he sent a matchmaker to deliver the gold ingot to Mrs. Lin. With no excuse left, Mrs. Lin had no choice but to honor her word and agree to the marriage. When Chang'e arrived at the Zhong household, Zhong Zimei told her about Diandong's response. Chang'e simply smiled and, unexpectedly, encouraged him to take Diandong as a concubine. Overjoyed, he immediately set out to share the news with Diandong. But days passed, and she was nowhere to be seen. Sensing that Diandong was deliberately avoiding her, Chang'e decided to step aside for a time to give them a chance to meet. Before leaving, she whispered to her husband, "Steal the sachet she wears." Sure enough, before long, Diandong reappeared. As Zhong Zimei broached the subject of taking her as a concubine, she did not refuse but only said there was no need to rush. As they grew closer in intimacy, Zhong Zimei caught sight of the violet sachet hanging from her waist, just as Chang'e had described. But the moment he reached out to untie it, Diandong noticed. Her face darkened in an instant. She pulled away sharply, her voice cold with anger. "You claim to love me, yet your heart is divided. You are nothing but a faithless man. Whatever bond we had ends here. Don't ever come looking for me again." Zhong Zimei was stunned. He pleaded, trying to explain, but Diandong would not listen. Without looking back, she turned and walked away. A few days later, Zhong Zimei passed by Diandong's home and stopped to inquire about her. He was told that she and her mother had long since moved away. The house was now rented by a family from Suzhou. As for where Diandong and her mother had gone, no one knew. Ever since Zhong Zimei married Chang'e, his household had grown suddenly prosperous. Towering pavilions and winding corridors stretched almost to the streets, a testament to their newfound wealth. Chang'e was lively and quick-witted. One day, the couple came across a painting of legendary beauties. Zhong Zimei sighed and said, "To me, there's no woman in the world as beautiful as you. But since I've never seen the famed Zhao Fian or Yang Yuhuan of ancient times, I wouldn't dare boast too much about my wife's beauty." Chang'e chuckled. "If you wish to see them, that's not so difficult." She took the painting, studied it carefully, then disappeared into the inner chamber. Before long, a delicate and ethereal Zhao Fian, light as a feather, glided out with graceful steps. After dancing elegantly, she returned to the chamber. Moments later, a full-figured Yang Yuhuan emerged, swaying slightly as if intoxicated. Their forms, features, and expressions mirrored the figures in the painting exactly. Just then, a maid entered the room. At the sight of Chang'e, she froze in confusion, unable to recognize her mistress at first. She whispered to another maid, then peered more closely before suddenly realizing the truth. Unable to hold back her laughter, she giggled. Seeing this, Zhong Zimei burst out laughing as well and said, "I thought I had married one beautiful wife, but it turns out I have all the beauties of history right here at home." One night, as the couple lay fast asleep, a gang of robbers broke into the house. The glow of torches illuminated the room as if it were daylight. Chang'e leapt up in fright, crying out, "Robbers!" Zhong Zimei awoke with a start, about to shout for help, but before he could make a sound, he felt the cold blade of a knife pressed against his throat. He dared not even breathe too loudly. Meanwhile, another bandit swiftly lifted Chang'e onto his back. The thieves shouted among themselves and, in a chaotic frenzy, rushed out of the house. When the robbers were gone, Zhong Zimei collapsed in anguish, weeping uncontrollably. The household servants came running, but to their astonishment, all the treasures, gold, and silver in the house remained untouched. Not a single coin had been taken. Grief consumed Zhong Zimei. Distraught and dazed, he went straight to the county magistrate the next morning to report the crime. However, the bandits had vanished without a trace. Despite efforts to investigate, the authorities found no leads, and the case was eventually left unsolved. Time passed, and 3 or 4 years slipped away. Without Chang'e, Zhai felt restless and empty. Weary of his stagnant life, he decided to leave home for a while, using the imperial examination as an excuse to travel to the capital and ease his troubled heart. He stayed in the capital for half a year, wandering the streets, making inquiries, consulting fortune-tellers, doing everything he could to uncover any clue about Chang'e's whereabouts. One day, Zhai wandered into a narrow alley called Yaojia Lane. As he strolled along, his eyes suddenly caught sight of a ragged, dust-covered woman hurrying forward. She looked like a beggar. He stopped in his tracks, studying her closely. To his shock, it was Diandong. Diandong. How did you end up like this? He asked in astonishment. Diandong let out a weary sigh and replied. After we parted that day, my mother and I moved south. Later, she passed away, and I was taken by wicked people and sold to a Manchu family. There, I suffered daily beatings and scoldings, enduring hunger and cold. It was a life of endless misery. Hearing this, Zhai was overcome with grief, tears streaming down his face. He hurriedly asked, "Can I buy your freedom?" Diandong sighed again. "It's too difficult. The price to redeem me is enormous. I doubt you can manage it." Zhai, undeterred, said with confidence. "To be honest with you, I've built up quite a bit of wealth over the years. But right now, I don't have much on me since I'm away from home. If needed, I wouldn't hesitate to sell all my clothes and horses. And if that's still not enough, I'll go back and get more." Diandong fell silent for a moment, then said, "Meet me tomorrow outside the western city, in the Willow Grove. Come alone, bring no one with you." Zhai nodded. "All right. I'll be there." The next morning, he could hardly contain his excitement as he made his way to the meeting place. But when he arrived, he was taken aback. Diandong was already there, yet she looked entirely different. Gone were the tattered clothes. Instead, she was dressed in luxurious silk, her entire demeanor transformed. Stunned, Zhai blurted out, How did you become so well-dressed?" Diandong let out a soft laugh. "Yesterday was merely a test, to see if you still cared about our past. Fortunately, you didn't disappoint me. Come, let's go to my home. I must properly repay your kindness." She led him a short distance to a charming courtyard. Inside, Diandong invited him to sit and set out an exquisite feast of fine wine and delicious dishes. As they drank and reminisced, Zhai couldn't help but urge her to return with him to his home. But Diandong shook her head. "I have many matters to tend to here. I can't go with you. However, I have heard some news about Chang'e." Zhai's heart leaped. "You know where she is?" he asked eagerly. Diandong sighed. "Her whereabouts are uncertain. I don't know exactly where she is now. But there is an old nun in the western mountains. She has only one eye. She might know something." Zhai was overjoyed upon hearing this. That night, he stayed at Diandong's house and decided to set off for western mountains early the next morning. At dawn, Diandong pointed Zhai toward the road leading to the western mountains. Following her instructions, he made his way there. The mountains were home to an ancient temple, its outer walls crumbling from years of neglect. Inside the temple grounds stood a dense bamboo grove, and deep within it, nestled an old thatched hut. From a distance, Zhai saw an elderly nun sitting inside, carefully mending a worn monk's robe. She took no notice of him as he approached, nor did she offer any greeting. Undeterred, Zhai stepped forward and bowed deeply. Only then did she lift her head and ask for the purpose of his visit. Zhai stated his name and earnestly pleaded for her help in finding Chang'e. The old nun sighed. "I am nearly 80 years old and blind. I have been living in seclusion for a long time. How could I possibly know anything about Chang'e?" But Zhai refused to give up, pleading again and again. Finally, the nun seemed to soften. After a long pause, she said slowly, "I truly do not know her whereabouts. However, I have some relatives who will visit me tomorrow night. Perhaps among them, the young women might have heard something. You may return then." With that, Zhai had no choice but to take his leave. The following evening, he returned to the temple, only to find it empty. The doors were locked, and the nun was nowhere to be seen. He had no choice but to wait outside. Hours passed. The moon climbed high into the sky, yet still, she did not return. Just as anxiety was gripping his heart, he suddenly spotted a group of young women approaching from the distance. His breath caught in his throat, for among them was none other than Chang'e. Overcome with joy, Zhai rushed forward and grabbed hold of her sleeve. Startled, Chang'e gasped. "You're so reckless. You nearly scared me to death. That gossiping girl Jiandong must have meddled again, tangling me up in worldly affections." Zhai, overwhelmed, pulled her to sit down beside him. Grasping her hands tightly, he poured out his sorrows, speaking of the years he had spent yearning for her. As he spoke, tears streamed down his face. Chang'e sighed at the sight of him and said, "I will tell you the truth. I am Chang'e, from the Moon Palace. Because I committed a mistake, I was banished to the mortal world. I have wandered here for a long time, but now my sentence is over. I must return to the Moon Palace. That is why I staged my own abduction, so you would believe I had disappeared from this world." She hesitated briefly, then continued. "That old nun is a disciple of the Queen Mother of the West. When I first arrived in the mortal realm, she was the one who took me in. I visit her often out of gratitude. If you let me go today, I will arrange for Jiandong to marry you." But Zhai refused to let her leave. He merely lowered his head, weeping in silence. Chang'e turned her gaze into the distance and murmured, "My sisters are coming." Zhai looked around, but in the blink of an eye, Chang'e had vanished without a trace. Despair gripped his heart. Overcome with sorrow, his mind sank into darkness, and he felt utterly lost. In his anguish, he untied the sash from his waist and looped it over a tree branch, hanging himself without hesitation. A strange sensation overcame him. His soul drifted free from his body, wandering aimlessly through an unfamiliar void. He felt weightless, unmoored, with no sense of where to go. Just then, Chang'e appeared before him once more. She reached out, grabbed him firmly, and lifted him up. His feet left the ground as he floated, carried by her unseen force, until they arrived at the temple. Then, Chang'e turned and gently untied the lifeless body hanging from the tree. Giving it a soft push, she sighed, "Foolish man. Chang'e is right here, why would you seek your own death?" At her words, Zhongzimei's eyes fluttered open as if waking from a dream. Bewildered, he sat up, unable to understand what had just happened or why he had experienced such a thing. Chang'e, however, was furious. That wretched maid Diandong, not only did she bring trouble upon me, but she nearly caused your death as well. I will never forgive her. Without another word, she summoned a sedan chair and had Zhongzimei sent back to his lodging. Once back at the inn, Zhongzimei immediately ordered his servants to pack their belongings. Meanwhile, he himself set out for the western part of the city, determined to thank Diandong in person. But when he arrived at the place where Diandong's house had stood, he was stunned to find it completely changed. The house was no longer there, the entire property had been abandoned, seemingly untouched for a long time. Startled and confused, he had no choice but to return to the inn. He comforted himself with the thought that Chang'e wouldn't know where he had just been. Yet the moment he stepped inside, Chang'e was already waiting for him. She greeted him with a knowing smile and asked, "So? Did you find Diandong?" Zhongzimei froze. Words caught in his throat. Chang'e chuckled. "You think you can do things behind my back? How could you possibly find Diandong?" She gestured toward a seat. "Sit down. Soon enough, she'll come to find you." Sure enough, before long, Diandong arrived as promised. The moment she stepped inside and caught sight of Chang'e, she immediately fell to her knees. Chang'e flicked her finger against Diandong's forehead and said with a sigh, "You little troublemaker. Do you have any idea how much trouble you've caused?" Diandong frantically knocked her head against the floor in supplication. "Please, have mercy on me. I swear, I'll never dare to do such a thing again." Chang'e scoffed. "You pushed me into this mess, and now you think you can slip away without punishment?" She crossed her arms and continued. "Miss 11 from the Moon Palace is soon to be married to a mortal. For her wedding, we need to prepare 100 pairs of embroidered pillows and 100 pairs of embroidered shoes. You'll have to come back with me and help make them." Diandong lowered her head and replied meekly, "Whatever you command, I will obey. I'll complete the task on time." Chang'e, however, shook her head solemnly, then turned to Zhongzimei. "If you plead for her, I might consider letting her go." Diandong cast a pitiful glance at Zhongzimei, hoping he would speak up for her. But he only smiled and said nothing. Seeing this, Diandong grew a little annoyed, but she had no other choice. She pleaded with Chang'e for some time to return home and inform her family before leaving. Chang'e agreed, and only then did Diandong dare to depart. After she had gone, Zhongzimei curiously asked Chang'e about Diandong's origins. It was only then that he learned the truth. Diandong was not human at all, but a fox spirit from the western mountains. That night, Zhongzimei made the necessary preparations, readying horses and carriages as he waited for Diandong's return. The next day, just as promised, Diandong arrived once more. The three of them set out together and finally returned to Zhongzimei's home. Yet from the moment Chang'e returned, she was no longer the same as before. Her demeanor grew solemn, and she seldom laughed or spoke lightly. When Zhongzimei tried to draw close to her, she would quietly send Diandong in her place. Diandong, clever and enchanting, was adept at bewitching men. Chang'e, on the other hand, preferred to spend her nights alone. If Zhongzimei wished to share a bed with her, she would always find a way to refuse. Late one night, past midnight, soft laughter drifted from Diandong's room. Curious, Chang'e sent a maid to investigate. But when the maid returned, she said nothing, only urged Chang'e to see for herself. Quiet as a shadow, Chang'e approached the window and peered inside. What she saw made her pause. Diandong had disguised herself as Chang'e and was nestled in Zhongzimei's arms. He held her tightly, murmuring over and over, "Chang'e. Chang'e." Watching this, Chang'e let out a soft chuckle, then silently withdrew. Just as Diandong was reveling in her triumph, a sharp pain stabbed through her chest. Startled, she threw on a robe, grabbed Zhongzimei's hand, and rushed into Chang'e's room. The moment they entered, Diandong dropped to her knees and pleaded, "Madam, I was wrong." Chang'e smiled coolly. "I am neither a doctor nor a sorceress. What use is it to beg me? Or perhaps you simply enjoy playing the role of a frail beauty, like Shisher?" Diandong kept knocking her forehead against the floor, frantically begging for forgiveness. At last, Chang'e relented. "Enough, get up." Diandong rose, let out an awkward laugh, and hurried away. One day, Diandong leaned close to Zhongzimei and whispered, "I can make Madam look like Guanyin." Zhongzimei was doubtful. They made a bet. Then, whenever Chang'e sat cross-legged in meditation with her eyes tightly closed, Diandong would quietly place a jade vase with a willow branch on the table beside her. She herself would let her hair fall loosely, press her palms together, and stand by Chang'e's side, her cherry lips slightly parted, revealing a glimpse of her jade-like teeth, while her eyes held a tranquil, water-like serenity. Seeing this scene, Zhongzimei couldn't help but laugh. Hearing him, Chang'e opened her eyes. "What are you two up to?" Diandong grinned. "I'm playing the dragon maiden, serving Guanyin." Chang'e couldn't help but laugh and scold her, then ordered her to imitate a temple boy paying respects to Guanyin. Without hesitation, Diandong tied her hair into a child's top knot and bowed in all directions. Then, with a mischievous turn, she flung herself down beside Chang'e, writhing playfully, twisting her body this way and that. At one point, she even nuzzled Chang'e's tiny foot with her ear. Chang'e, laughing, nudged her away with her foot. But to her surprise, Diandong suddenly lifted her head and gently bit the tip of Chang'e's toe. A deep flush crept over Chang'e's face. A shiver, tingling and electric, traveled from her toes to her very core. Her heart fluttered in a way she hadn't expected. Abruptly, she snapped herself out of it, eyes darkening. "Wretched fox," she snapped. "Do you even know who stands before you? How dare you try to bewitch me?" Terrified, Diandong immediately released her bite, falling to the floor and pressing her forehead to the ground, too afraid to meet Chang'e's gaze. Chang'e, still seething, scolded her harshly. The others, watching from the sidelines, had no idea why she was so furious. Turning to Zhongzimei, she said, "Diandong is, after all, a fox. Even in human form, she cannot change her nature. Just now, she nearly made a fool of me. If my will was any weaker, I might have already fallen for her tricks." From that moment on, Chang'e remained cautious whenever Jiandang was near, determined to prevent her from making any more frivolous advances. Jiandang, on the other hand, was consumed by both shame and fear. She confided in Zhai, saying, "I love Madam. Even her hands and feet, I adore them. My love for her is so overwhelming that I unconsciously seek to enchant her. If she believes I harbor any disloyalty toward her, she is mistaken. It is not just that I wouldn't dare, more than that, I couldn't bear to." Zhai relayed these words to Chang'e, and at last, her demeanor softened. She began treating Jiandang as she had before. However, the playful intimacy between Jiandang and Zhai remained unchecked. Chang'e repeatedly admonished Zhai, but he simply ignored her words. As time went on, even the servants in the household began to follow suit, becoming more and more unrestrained in their playful behavior. One day, 2 servants propped up a maid, dressing her as Yang Yuhuan. Exchanging mischievous glances, they urged her to act out the famed beauty's drunken stupor. Suddenly, they released their grip. The maid tumbled down the stone steps with a thunderous crash, like a wall collapsing. A collective gasp swept through the onlookers. They rushed forward in alarm, only to discover that the maid had died on impact. Panic-stricken, the crowd scattered, rushing to inform the master of the house. When Chang'e heard the news, her face went pale. "Disaster is upon us," she cried. "I warned you all, this should never have happened." Hastily, she made her way to the scene. After examining the maid several times, she confirmed there was no saving her. Without delay, she ordered a messenger to summon the girl's father. The maid's father, a man of poor reputation known as Zhai, arrived in a fit of rage, cursing as he carried his daughter's body into the main hall. Storming inside, he bellowed accusations at the household. At the sight of him, Zhai paled and immediately bolted his door, too afraid to face the situation. But Chang'e stepped forward with a cold, piercing glare. She rebuked Zhai sharply. "Even if a master were to beat a servant to death, the law does not demand their life in return. What's more, your daughter died by accident. And besides, how do you know she cannot be brought back?" Zhai scoffed, his voice raw with grief. "Her limbs have gone cold. How could she possibly come back to life?" Chang'e arched an eyebrow. "Enough of your reckless shouting. Even if she truly cannot return, this matter should first be handled by the authorities." With that, she approached the lifeless maid, knelt down, and gently touched her body. A moment later, the girl stirred. Slowly, she opened her eyes and sat up. The entire room fell into stunned silence. Chang'e rose to her feet, turned on Zhai, and thundered. "You wretched scoundrel! If this girl had truly died, you would have taken advantage of the situation to extort us. That's why you dared to behave so outrageously. Someone should tie you up with straw ropes and drag you straight to the magistrate." Zhai was left speechless. With no words to defend himself, he could only fall to his knees, begging for mercy. Chang'e looked down at him and said, "Since you now realize your mistake, I will let this matter rest for today. But your nature is deceitful, and you are fickle at heart. If your daughter remains here, she will only bring trouble sooner or later. Take her away, but you must compensate us for the price we paid when we bought her. She ordered her attendants to escort Zhai outside and instructed him to bring the village elders as guarantors to sign a formal agreement. Then she called the maid forward and asked, "You're not hurt, are you?" The maid quickly shook her head. "No, not at all." Chang'e nodded and signaled that she was free to leave with her father. Once they were gone, she gathered the rest of the maids and scolded them harshly, punishing each one accordingly. Then she summoned Diandong and forbade her from ever indulging in such reckless behavior again. At last, she turned to Zhai and said, "Surely, today you've come to understand this. When you are a leader, every word you speak, every gesture you make, carries weight. You must never take that lightly. These foolish games, weren't they first started by me? But look what happened. When the higher-ups behave one way, the lower ranks will follow. And now, this has led to disaster. In cultivation, sorrow belongs to the realm of yin, while joy belongs to the realm of yang. As they say, when yang reaches its peak, yin arises. When joy is excessive, grief follows. Yin and yang ebb and flow in endless cycles, rising and falling in turn. What has happened in this household is a warning from the spirits. If we refuse to wake up, ruin will surely descend upon us." Zhai stood silently, absorbing her words, deep shame washing over him. Diandong, meanwhile, had begun to weep. She turned to Chang'e, begging for salvation. Chang'e coldly pinched Diandong's ear and only let go after a long while. Diandong sat there, dazed. But then, as if suddenly struck by revelation, she fell to her knees. A light of joy flickered in her eyes, and she broke into an ecstatic dance, waving her hands and stamping her feet like a child. From that day on, the atmosphere in the Zhai household changed. The rowdy laughter and careless teasing faded away, replaced by an air of calm and order. A few days after the maid returned home, something strange happened. She died suddenly, without any apparent cause. Jia, her father, still had no way of paying the compensation. In desperation, he turned to the village elders, pleading with them to intercede on his behalf before Chang'e. Chang'e, however, did not make things difficult for him. She agreed at once to release him from the debt. Moreover, in recognition of the maid's years of service to the household, she generously provided a coffin for her burial. Zhai often fretted over the fact that he had no sons to carry on his lineage. Then, one day, a baby's cry suddenly rang out from within Chang'e's body. She showed no surprise. Calmly, she took a blade, sliced open her left rib, and pulled out a baby boy. Not long after, she appeared to be pregnant again. This time, she cut open her right rib and delivered a baby girl. The boy bore an uncanny resemblance to Zhai, while the girl looked more like Chang'e herself. As they grew, both children eventually married into noble and illustrious families, ensuring that the Zhai bloodline flourished for generations to come. The author concludes the story with these reflections. Things always reverse when they reach an extreme. This truly is an eternal truth. And yet, it was only because there was a celestial being in the household that Zhai could find happiness, that he could avoid disaster, that his life could be extended, even that he could be brought back from the dead. To have such a wonderful wife was the very source of his joy. Even if he were to grow old and die at home, he would never feel sorrow. But then, if Chang'e is truly a goddess, why does she still worry that excessive joy will lead to sorrow? It seems that the cycles of the heavens turn ceaselessly, over and over again, and all things follow a predetermined course. Even immortals cannot change this. Yet, in this mortal world, there are so many people who suffer endlessly, enduring hardship after hardship without ever tasting happiness. How are we to explain that? This reminds me of a man from the Song dynasty who spent his entire life trying to become an immortal but never succeeded. In the end, he sighed and said, "Even if I could be a celestial being for just one day, I would die with no regrets." At first, these words might sound amusing. But when I heard them, I found that I could not laugh at all. The story features several female figures, each of whom holds an important place in Chinese history and mythology. The first, of course, is the protagonist, Chang'e. If you'd like to learn more about the goddess Chang'e, please check out the Mid-Autumn Festival episode in my channel's playlist. I won't go into too much detail here. The second is Yang Yuhuan, one of ancient China's most famous beauties. Yang Yuhuan, courtesy name Taizhen, was originally the wife of Prince Shou, the son of Emperor Xuanzong of Tang. However, Emperor Xuanzong fell deeply in love with her and brought her into the palace, making her his consort. Known to the world as Yang Yuhuan, she was renowned not only for her unparalleled beauty but also for her exquisite talent in singing and dancing. She was counted among China's 4 legendary beauties, described as one who could make fish sink, geese fall, the moon hide, and flowers blush. Yang Yuhuan's rise to favor led to the growing power of her cousin, the politician Yang Guizhong, whose influence contributed to increasing corruption in the imperial court. In 755, the Anlushan rebellion broke out, forcing Emperor Xuanzong to flee to Sichuan. During their journey, at Maui Post Station, the imperial guards mutinied, demanding that Yang Guizhong and the Yang family be executed. Under pressure, Yang Yuhuan was also forced to take her own life, dying by hanging at the age of 38. However, some unofficial accounts claim that Emperor Xuanzong secretly spared her and sent her to Japan. The famous Japanese singer Momo Yamaguchi even once claimed that Yang Yuhuan was her ancestor. To this day, the truth of Yang Yuhuan's fate remains a mystery. Her tragic story inspired countless poets throughout history, with Bai Zhi's Song of Everlasting Regret being the most famous. The poem ends with the lines, "Though heaven and earth may fade, this sorrow shall endure forever." The third figure is Zhao Fian, a celebrated beauty of the Western Han dynasty. Zhao Fian was the empress of Emperor Chang'e of Han. Born into a lowly background, she captivated the emperor with her extraordinary beauty and grace, eventually rising to become empress. A skilled dancer, Zhao Fian was known for her delicate, slender figure. She and her younger sister, Zhao Heda, dominated the imperial harem, suppressing rival concubines. However, she remained childless, and her influence contributed to the decline of the imperial bloodline. After Emperor Chang's death, Zhao Fian was deposed and reduced to the status of a commoner. In the end, she took her own life in despair. Her striking contrast to Yang Yuhuan, one famed for her voluptuous beauty, the other for her ethereal slenderness, led to the famous saying, "Huan Fei Yan Shou," which originally described their differing appearances. Over time, this phrase came to express the idea that even two completely opposite things can each possess their own unique beauty and strengths. Alright. That's all for today's strange tale, Chang'e. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe. Feel free to leave your comments and share with others. See you again in the next issue.